as Danny said, there are an infinite number of reactions. But in science, you can just be absolutely wrong and you've got to let it go. And most scientists are wrong most of the time. So that's what I meant by that. What was the last bit of the question? Was how you square them?
I was just going to ask, though, because do you think that should change, though? Like, do you think that more should be done to try and humanise the discourse a bit more?
Well, I think, to me, certainly when I make television programmes, I'm not lecturing. I lecture to undergraduates as well, and that's much more of a brutal pursuit than making a television programme. So I suppose it's doing what Sunshine does. Actually, it's showing trying to strip away the necessary scaffolding, because science is a mechanistic pursuit in a way, but to strip back to see the tremendous emotional power of the questions that you're trying to answer, and the beauty of nature that's revealed more, I think, by understanding it. Very famous physicist Richard Feynman talked about this a lot, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, who had an argument with an artist friend of his, a very famous argument. He recounted it on Horizon, I think, and it was about the beauty of a flower. And his artist friend said to him, you scientists, you're taking away the beauty of this flower. And Feynman said, no, if you understand that the colours are there to attract insects, for example, why do they attract insects? How did they evolve? Does that mean there's an aesthetic sense in the lower forms? Maybe it's interesting. So knowing more about something can only add to the grandeur. That's what Feynman used to say. And I think that's true as well. So I think that's the point. When you communicate in science, you've got to make sure that people see the power, the emotional power, but also understanding the fact that we do actually get to useful things like transistors in the modern world as well. But so we've got to be careful.
So just on the flower thing, Philip Larkin said life is the million-petaled flower of being here.
Feynman went on to say the final argument he gives, which is like, I don't know what the average age of the audience is here, but I'll tell you anyway. he said in the end he got exasperated with his artist friend because his artist said to him, "What happens if a woman walks into a room and bears a breast to you? Do you look at them and say, look at those remarkable things, they've evolved to provide milk for the child, or do you just put your face in and go, boo-boo-boo?" Feynman said,
And so the tone which began so high, and there we have it. Let's take another question.
Hi.
Where are you? Somebody said hi with a microphone. Where?
Here.
Oh, there, fine, good. Well, there, the gentleman has the microphone.
Thank you. So, how plausible is all that, sending a ship to the sun with a bomb to reignite it?
Danny?
Well, interestingly, no. One of the things that the bomb was originally, the bomb is described in the film as being the size of Manhattan Island, and interestingly, in the original script, it was the size of Kansas, which was like. But we couldn't depict it. We needed a scene at the end where they're actually on the bomb, and you can't kind of capture Kansas in one camera angle. It's like, so we reduced the size of it to the size of Manhattan, and that threw up a whole bunch of interesting stuff, which Brian helped us with, about gravity and mass, and that it would have its own gravitational pull. And hence you can, I don't know whether you got it from the film, it was very difficult hence you can stand on any side of this cube because the gravitational pull is so strong. And the other thing, I remember Brian telling us this, is that when this bomb would be made, it would be built in space, of course, because the difficult thing, the impossible thing to do, would only be to lift it off the Earth. So they would build it in space. And of course, after we'd made the film, I remember going to see Star Trek, the first remake of Star Trek, and that spaceship is built in space, and he turns up the young Captain Kirk, doesn't he, on his motorbike or his bicycle, and he looks at it being built in space, and that's where we'll build them for these journeys. And the International Space Station is the first example of it, I think.
Yeah, I remember didn't it used to be the mass of the moon at one point as well? Because wasn't there an idea that the moon would have been used at one point in the early script?
Yeah, that was one of the
In Dalek's Invasion Earth 2150, they drill the centre out of the Earth and turn it into a spaceship. Never mind. Let's take another question. Let's go at the back. There. the gentleman runs down.
But just while Mike's waiting, it's how plausible is it? I guess if you asked that question before the atom bomb was discovered, you would ask that similar kind of question. How is something on that scale's unimaginable, isn't it? And then it happens. So I guess it could happen in a way. Whether you can get it near the sun, near enough the sun, but then if the sun was dying, perhaps you could, to reignite it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reigniting bit's probably stretching it a tad. but we do send spacecraft to the sun. The sun's interesting. It's not that hot at the surface. I mean, it is hot. It's 6,000 degrees though. You can imagine hotter than that. The atmosphere though is millions of degrees. So it's very strange. It's one of the strange places in nature where there's a surface which is heating something up, and the thing it's heating up is hotter than the surface. It's because of the way the magnetic fields work around the sun. And then as you go into the core, then you're at 15 million degrees, and then you're getting pretty warm.
Gentleman who has the microphone at the back now, I presume.
Question about the name, sunshine. Sunshine's a word that has almost universally positive connotations, but the movie itself is, if not dark, then quite uncompromising. Did you have a long sort of process for picking over the name, or did it come to you quite quickly?
No, it was Alex's original title for the piece, and I think his intention was a slight duality about it, the word sunshine, and then the idea of sunshine, was the bomb travelling towards it. I think what we were saying earlier about these kind of serious sci-fi pieces, they usually have a bleak hinterland, usually. The sense of them is usually bleak in some way. I mean, actually, it's an optimistic ending. He does save the planet, if you like, and the whited out Sydney will be saved, where his sister has mysteriously moved to Sydney. Yeah, they're usually very, very, very bleak. And the reason why is, I think, that it is hostile. It is there to kill us, really. It will kill you, really. And we're not meant to be there. And part of our nature, our wonderful infinite nature, is that we insist on being there somehow, even though we shouldn't be, because it's designed to kill us at any moment, really. And I think that's why they always have a bleak sense about them.
The thing I like about science fiction, like as Danny said, serious science fiction, is it addresses it's a central question about, I suppose, about meaning in the universe, really. I mean, Alex, I think, as Danny said, I think he misunderstands himself a bit, because he's terrified by his atheism, as far as I can see. Or certainly this. I mean, I remember speaking to him about it. This idea that we might be alone in this infinite, purposeless universe terrifies him and terrifies a lot of people. Actually, though, I take a more optimistic view of this. I think the universe is meaningless in the strict technical sense. There's no teleological explanation for the universe, but there's self-evidently meaning in it because it means something to us. So there's an island of meaning here on Earth, and that's a very important recognition, actually. I was talking to Chris Hadfield last night, actually, Commander Hadfield, the space station, famously the Space Oddity that he recorded in space, and he said that being in orbit for 6 months, he was in orbit for 6 months. And he said there was no, he didn't have some kind of spiritual awakening or anything like that, and no one on his crew did. But what they did do was develop a very strong sense of the value of Earth, and also a sense that it's one Earth. It's an island of meaning and beauty in a universe that may well be meaningless beyond our solar system.
And there was an amazing book we read called Moon Dust, which is written by a British novelist, I think, called Andrew Smith. Do you remember? And he interviews all the people who've been to the moon, all the astronauts who've actually been to the moon. He interviewed them all except Neil Armstrong, who's famously not available for interviews. And he talked about, it is extraordinary, because he talks about the first time that they went to the moon on the first mission, Apollo...
Well, it'd be 8, the first one, the Earthrise mission.
The ones that went round the moon. Yeah. Those 3 people, when they went round the back of the moon, were the first one of our species ever to be out of sight of the Earth. And then when they landed on the moon, when Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, And not
well, that was 11, and Collins was on Apollo 11 on his own,
and he was alone. And that is the definition of aloneness: is when he went around the dark side of the moon, and where there was no radio communications and no sight of Earth. He was the first of our species to be truly, truly alone. And although we use this phrase about we're alone in the universe, we're not alone in the universe because we're all here together, and it's that sense of community that we use to offset that loneliness, I think.
You see that? I could ask you a question, because Pinbacker has that line about being the last man, doesn't he? I mean, how did you see that? Because I find it a very powerful line, echoing something Collins said, actually. He said when he was on the... So before that, the Apollo missions had gone around the moon, but all three of them had been together. And when Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface, he was on his own. And he writes quite powerfully about just sitting there in this little capsule and looking there and saying, everybody's over there and nobody's there. And I'm the last person, I'm the outpost. And Pinbacker says that, doesn't he, the last man? So how did you see that? What was he expressing there?
I mean, you should read that bit of the H.P. Lovecraft that you were talking about, which is the same idea. It's absolutely, in his respect, it's absolutely egotistical as well, I think. He wants to be the last man before God, really, so that he has that unique relationship with him.
Well, also it's interesting that that's a central soliloquy in the ninth configuration, which is, William Peter Blatty being, which the whole thing is an astronaut who won't go into space because he's lost faith in there being a God. And he does a whole speech about, because if you're up there and you're alone, and if there really is no God, then that really is properly alone. So that is an idea that's discussed in cinema in a profoundly religious sense. I'm aware that we should take a few more photos.
I was just going to just read this, because I just said to Danny when I was sat at home this afternoon thinking about this, I googled something. I remembered a Nietzsche quote about the fear of infinite spaces. There's a beautiful quote and I was looking that up on Google, and I found this quote from Lovecraft, the science fiction writer I hadn't really encountered. I hadn't read any of it, and I said to Danny, "This sounds like Pinbacker." And it's a great quote. So he says, in Pinbacker's the first speech, when Kappa meets him in the observation room. And this quote from Lovecraft, he says, "The human race will disappear. Other races will appear and disappear in turn. The sky will become icy and void, pierced by the feeble light of half-dead stars, which will also disappear. Everything will disappear. And what human beings do is just as free of sense as the free motion of elementary particles. Good, evil, morality, feelings, pure Victorian fictions. Only egotism exists." Which is I actually find quite, in a way, uplifting, because what it says, it really does say that there's egotism, our collective ego, the human race, perhaps that is the only ego in the universe. And I think that our rarity makes us potentially valuable. And I think that's what Pinbacker, for me, is kind of touching on something almost. He's kind of almost got the right idea, but it's so overwhelming that it sends him off into this kind of terrorist rage, doesn't it? He becomes a religious fundamentalist, I suppose, doesn't he? But it's kind of almost a valid reaction to that I just read out. Some reaction is appropriate. The only way you don't react to that is if you don't think about it.
Sure, absolutely. Should we take another question? Yes, let's go there.
So I'm a trainee medic, and we've actually, in a course a couple of weeks ago, we used 28 days later as a kind of blueprint for what we do in such a scenario if we were medics. And I'm just wondering, with Professor Cox's work...
It's not the end, presumably, when you go...
It was the start, mainly. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, with Professor Cox's work on the Wonders of Life, and the more biology side, could you see yourself coming together to, say, work on 28 months later or 28 years later?
What do you mean by... I don't know, it depends whether Danny wants to. I always work with Danny if he wants to make another science fiction film. I'd love to.
I would never make another space movie. Space movies do drive you. Nobody ever goes back into space. No filmmaker goes back into space unless they're part of a franchise that we know about. But because it just drives you. I mean, you get as near death as you're ever going to get in a job like that. And you can see it there's a big change just happened, huge change just happened in terms of, since 2001, we've all made films in the same way, which is that we've tried to create gravity-free conditions. On Earth, we tried to do it at 3 mils, and it just drives you insane trying to actually do it. It's very simple, and it just shows you what is the most defining thing. Apart from oxygen, it's gravity. It's the most defining thing about us, because you try and contradict it in a plausible way on film for you as an audience, it'll take you months to even create just a couple of minutes of it. And the thing that's changed, because they've all been made like that, is Gravity, the Alfonso Cuarón. And when he took a completely different approach, which is he basically photographed faces and then he CG'd every other thing like that. And it is an extraordinary film if you've not seen it. And it's one of the things that I found particularly wonderful about it is that I was aware when we were making this film that if I showed gravity as it exists, the lack of gravity as it exists at the International Space Station, you wouldn't believe it in a film, because since 2001 it's always been represented in slow motion like that, and that's free of gravity. In fact, it's nonsense. If you watch the International Space Station, they move at the same speed as on Earth. If anything, they move slightly quicker because there's less resistance. There's just nothing to stop them. But if you put that in a film, you wouldn't believe it. You'd just say, that's bollocks, he's cheated. And he's changed that with Gravity, because Gravity does portray it as it is, and it is remarkably convincing, and I think that will be a game changer in the way that we present stories in space like that and make our lives a bit easier, I think.
Were you impressed by Gravity?
Yeah, I thought it was a magnificent spectacle.
That sounds like a very loaded compliment. Magnificent spectacle.
Well, no, I mean, it's the same as all films. I remember Danny saying to me, because if I point something out and say, yeah, but I'm not making a documentary. I mean, they're not documentary, they're dramas. And so there are things in Gravity that are not exactly right, but it looks right. And again, Chris Hadfield last night said it looks right.
Yeah.
And he had done 2 spacewalks. He said actually he got the feeling that was represented beautifully in it, the dizzying feeling. He said he spent one spacewalk and he was fixing something and it went wrong, something, or a screw wasn't in the right place. So he said to Houston, what shall I do? And they said, just hang on a sec. And they left him there for 15 minutes and didn't say anything. And he said for the first time he had the time to look around, and because he didn't have anything to do. And he said that he was hanging on to this. He said it's a bit of cloth, basically, that he was hanging on to the space station, whizzing around the Earth. And he said he just eventually just went, I'm going to let go of the cloth. I'm going to float here, and floated on his own. And he said it was the most remarkable feeling to be on your own, literally on your own, and you see that in Gravity. It's beautifully represented. So I think that's I loved it as a film.
Yeah, no, me too. It was great.
It was brilliant.
Absolutely. Let's take another question. Let's go over there. Let's go to the gentleman here.
So how many years is it until the sun's going to burn out?
Well, about 5 billion. But the Andromeda Galaxy is going to hit us in 3.
So nothing to worry about.
But what about sort of distilling out all our water with the global warming? I mean, is that going to be before?
The sun, before it runs out of fuel, it swells up, and so actually less than that, 2 billion or something, it gets too hot. Yeah. Don't worry though. Even there's a very famous story about Patrick Moore who said something like this, and someone put their hand up in panic and said, "Did you say 5 million or 5 billion?"
Okay, let's take another question. At the very back there.
I'd say one thing that, interestingly, the sense of threat in the universe is real. There's a star, a very famous picture of a star called Eta Carinae, which is a star that's it's actually a double star, huge thing. One of them's 300 times the mass of the sun, one of them's 100 times the mass of the sun, and it's already semi-exploded once in human history and looked like a supernova explosion. And there's spectacular images of this thing with big gas clouds coming out of it. And it's likely to explode again in a very big supernova. soon, like, you know, and by that you mean a few million years, or maybe a few thousand years, or maybe tomorrow. And it's only 7,500 light years away from us. And it's been calculated or suggested that if its spin axis were pointing towards us, which it isn't, it's pointing away, a lot of the energy goes along the spin axis of the star, then it would deposit, some calculations suggest, a kiloton of TNT in energy per square kilometre at the Earth, right, which should cause problems, like probably completely decimate the Earth's atmosphere. Now it happens that it's not pointing towards us. But so these things, although you can, you know, say, well, the sun is relatively stable and that's fine, but many suns aren't. And some of them in our neighbourhood are not stable in quite a dangerous way. We've not found any that are pointing towards us that are likely to have one of these huge supernova explosions. But there are a couple. Betelgeuse or Betelgeuse in Orion is another one, which is pretty close, but a few thousand light years away, which would cause trouble if it were pointing at us. It just, luck would have it that it isn't.
Gentleman with the microphone there.
Hi. Right, so obviously the idea of Icarus is very evident, like no one can become God, and like the sun is such a powerful force it can just whip down anyone that tries. What would you, like, how far should humans go to try and figure things out? Because obviously it's quite a powerful moral message within Sunshine.
Danny, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I suppose I believe in us, our minds, but they're not unconnected to our sense of wonder, which is a more abstract feature. It should wander infinitely, really, across all these questions. So yeah, I'm a big believer in that, really. So to answer the gentleman's other question is, could this happen? I would say, yeah, you should say it will happen. You know, we will attempt, we've done it already on our planet with great results and catastrophic results, trying to alter our environment, and I think we'll do it again, really. Whether that means that we'll, like one of Alex's idea was to, and I think this is where you got the moon idea from, what they talked about this, it was to put engines on the moon and actually push, you know, if we had to leave Earth, one of the things they were considering was to put engines on the moon, and actually that we would go and live there, and these engines would fire and move the moon away from the orbit of the Earth, which
is actually, although it's not engines, it's a crash, is the plot of Space 1999. No, but I'm not saying that's it. It's, you know, there's moon bases on the Earth, on the moon, and the moon is knocked out of Earth's atmosphere and then travels through the universe as a spaceship.
So some of Space 1999 qualifies as serious science fiction, actually, doesn't it? I like some episodes of that. I think they're superb, actually. But yeah. If I could answer the question, I think the universe is amoral, in my view. So you can't. The question, should humans attempt to understand it and manipulate it, seems to me to be I don't mean since. I was going to say it's a meaningless question. That's not meant as an insult. It's an important question to ask. But given that, as far as we know, we are the only place in the universe where there are any assemblages of atoms, as Carl Sagan called them, that are capable of understanding atoms. It seems to me that there's no question. That there's no right or wrong about trying to understand the universe. There's just I suppose there's an imperative to do so, in the sense that if we don't, then nobody may do so, and it may well wipe us out and cause us problems.
And our successors, which will be robots presumably, will take on that work from us, because we will approach the moment of singularity before any of these other things happen. That will probably happen, which will make us unnecessary in that quest, I think, because the machines that we've made will then take on that quest from us, I guess.
And how does that make you then relate to, you know, that key question in Jurassic Park, with the line that Jeff Goldblum says that everyone quotes is, you spent so much time worrying if you could, you never stopped to think about if you should. And that's the underlying question in Jurassic Park.
Should, but in that sense, it's an operational question, isn't it? It's like, will we fuck it up if we bring dinosaurs back onto the earth? It seems to be a very practical question.
It's not moral, it's practical.
What we often call morality in science is actually the practicality of such questions. So, should we keep copies of the smallpox vaccine, for example? We do. It's there. The idea is that you need it for research purposes. So atomic bombs, should we do that? Well, you could argue they kept the peace. You could argue they don't keep the peace. But they're not moral questions, are they? It seems to me they're practical questions.
Okay. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. I think there's a hand up there, and then we'll go. Is that a hand? That is, isn't it? Yes, just there. Sorry, it's a hand with a glove on, and it's kind of dark. So yes. Oh, it is Darren, in fact.
Thanks, Mark. I just wondered, in terms of cerebral sci-fi, if it had a non-digital, non-3D, preferably non-colour future.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, we're concerned about pushing the boundaries too far and what risks that would have to the human race. I'm wondering, when we develop different forms of cinema, is it actually putting cinema at risk?
Why? Because film becomes obsolete, or you mean the mechanics of film, like moving to digital? Or?
Yes.
Well, it's happened. It's over. I mean, it's literally you can't make film. I mean, I think the only person who can do it at the moment is Chris Nolan, because he has enough power to say, I want to make films on celluloid, but there's nowhere to develop them anymore. I mean, literally. It's over. It's now all this camera you'll hear about called the Alexa. Which it used to be the Red camera, now it's the Alexa, which it's incredible what it can do. And it's weird. It's so far behind sound. Sound went digital in movies 15 years ago, probably. About 15 years ago.
Maybe even longer ago than that.
Yeah, and everybody kept promising it'll happen with film, and it didn't, and then suddenly, in the blink of an eye, they're gone. The film cameras are gone. You can't get them now. I mean, students will probably get some and make something on 16mm, but it's over that now. It's all digital now, and will always be. And it's interesting, sound, apart from when it first caught up with pictures, has always led. Its innovations have always come via sound. It is extraordinary sound and especially when you make a movie in space, the use of sound is everything. Obviously there is none in space, but you can't really have that in a film about space because you'd think the projector wasn't working or there's something wrong with the speakers if there isn't some kind of atmosphere there. You can take it out occasionally, and he does that in Gravity in a couple of places. And Gravity was done, the sound on Gravity was done by Glenn Fremantle, who did the sound on this as well. And there is no light without sound. That's an old saying in the movie business, and it's true. These things are unbearable to watch without. You don't think this, but without sound, or if the sound goes wrong, they're unbearable. You can watch them for about 2 minutes, and then it's over. It's all sound in the end. But anyway, they're all digital now. Send them pictures.
But is there any part of you that mourns that or feels that something has been lost in the loss of digital? Has people always had that idea about the alchemical magic of film? Somehow light passing through celluloid and bouncing off a screen, there was something alchemical about, whether it's Kenneth Anger talking about it as a magical incantation, or whether it's going right back to cave paintings of people doing, people making shadows dance on the walls. There is something about that has been severed by the arrival of digital. Does it in any way worry you?
It doesn't worry me, no. I mean, it's ones and zeros now, isn't it? It's just ones and zeros. Everything's ones and zeros. It was an incredibly poisonous industry. It never had much impact on the planet because it's so small, the film industry. But actually, for its size, it's one of the most poisonous chemical processes there is, really, the development of film. So it's good that it's gone in a way, really. And I don't think you can be nostalgic about it, or Luddite about it either. I think you have to let, because people will always do that, and